The Primitive House. The Lily Lake Beaver House, in which the old beaver spent the droughty winter, was a large, roughly rounded affair that measured 22 feet in diameter. It rose only 4 feet above the normal water line. This house had been 3 times altered and enlarged, and once raised in height. Its mud walls were heavily reinforced with pole-like sticks, which were placed at the junctures of the enlargements. The one large room was more than 12 feet in diameter. Near the center stood a support for the upper part of the house. This support was about 1.5 by 2.5 feet and was composed for the most part of sticks. But few houses have this support. Commonly the room is vaulted. The room itself averaged 2.5 feet high. It had 4 entrances. A house commonly has 2 entrances, but it may have only 1 or as many as 5. Thus the way to the outer world from the inside of the house is through 1 or more inclined passageways or tunnels. The upper opening of these entrances is in the floor a few inches above the water level, and the lower opening in the bottom of the pond under about 3 feet of water. These extend at an angle through the solid foundation of the house, are about 1 foot in diameter and 4 to 15 feet long, and are full of water almost to floor level. This dark, windowless hut has no other entrance. Most beaver houses stand in a pond, though a number are built on the shore and partly in the water, and still others on the bank a few feet away from the water. The external appearance and internal construction of the houses are in a general way the same, regardless of the situation or size. Most beaver houses appear conical. Measured on the water line, they are commonly found to be slightly elliptical. The diameter on the water line is from 5 to 35 feet, and the height above water is from 3 to 7 feet. A house may be built almost entirely of sticks, or of a few sticks with a larger proportion of mud and turf. In building, a small opening is left, or built around and over, which is afterwards enlarged into a room. Houses that are built in a pond usually stand in 3 or 4 feet of water. The foundation is laid on the bottom of the pond, the size intended for the house, and built up a solid mass to a few inches above water level. This island-like foundation is covered with a crude hemisphere or dome-shaped house, the central portion of the foundation forming the floor of the low vaulted room which is enclosed by the thick house walls. In building the house, the beaver provide a temporary support for the combined roof and walls by piling in the center of the floor a 2-foot mound of mud. Over this is placed a somewhat flattened teepee or cone-shaped frame of sticks and small poles. These stand on the outer part of the foundation and lean inward, with upper ends meeting against and above the temporary support. The beaver then cover this framework with 2 or 3 feet of mud, brush, and turf, and thus make the walls and the roof of the house. When the outer part of the house is completed, they dig an inclined passageway from the bottom of the pond up through the foundation into the irregular space left between the supporting pile of mud and the walls. And of this space they shape a room by clawing out the temporary support and gnawing off the intruding sticks. This represents the most highly developed type of beaver house. In most houses, the temporary support is not used, but a part of the wall is carried up to completion, and against it are lean sticks which rest upon the edge of the remaining foundation. A finished house of this kind has a slightly elliptical outline. However, many a house is a crude, haphazard pile of material in which a room has been burrowed. The room is from 1 to 3 feet high and from 3 to 20 feet across. The room is a kind of burrow and is without either door or window. Half-buried sticks make a comparatively dry floor, despite the fact that it is only a few inches above water level. Beaver sleep on the floor, usually with tail bent along the side after the fashion of a dozing cat, in a nest of shredded wood, which they patiently make by thinly splitting and paring pieces of wood. Just why this kind of bedding is used cannot be said, but probably because this material dries more quickly, is more comfortable and more sanitary, and harbors fewer parasites. However, a few beds are made of grass, leaves, or moss. But little earthy matter is used in the tip-top of the house, where the minute disjointed air holes between the interlaced poles give the room scanty ventilation. Except in a few cases where the house walls are overgrown with willows or grass, the erosive action of wind and water rapidly thins and weakens them. Hence the house must receive frequent repairs. Each autumn it is plastered or piled all over with sticks or mud. The mud covering varies in thickness from 2 to 6 inches. The mud for this purpose is usually dredged from the bottom of the pond close to the foundation of the house. It is carried up, a double handful at a time, the beaver waddling on his hind legs as he holds it with his forepaws against his breast. A half dozen or more beaver may be carrying mud up at once. The covering not only thickens the walls and increases the warmth of the house, but also freezes and becomes an armor of stone that is impregnable to most beaver enemies. The mudding of the house is a part of the natural and necessary preparation for winter. It may also be a special means of protection deliberately carried out by the beaver. The fact that an occasional thick-walled or grass-covered beaver house was not thus plastered in autumn, perhaps because it did not need it, has led a few people to affirm that beaver houses are not mud-covered in the autumn. Many years of observation show that most beaver houses do receive an autumnal plastering, and the few that do not have this attention usually have thick, well-preserved walls and do not need it. One autumn in Montana, of 27 beaver houses which I examined, 21 received mud covering, 3 of the others were thickly overgrown with willows, and 2 were grass-grown. Only one thin-walled house that needed reinforcement did not receive it, and this one, by the way, was broken into by a bear before the winter had got fairly underway. In the autumn of 1910, I made notes concerning 18 houses. These I watched during October and November. 13 were plastered, a willow-grown one and a weed-grown one, both of which had thick walls, were not plastered. The remaining 3 were not greatly in need of additional thickness, so received only a scanty covering of sticks. 2 of these were broken into by some animal during the winter, while none of the others were disturbed. Beaver frequently show good judgment in that important matter of selecting a site for the house. Ice and sediment are 2 factors with which the beaver must constantly contend. In the pond, the house is commonly placed in deep water, and apparently where the depth around it will not be rapidly reduced by the depositing of sediment. Keeping the house entrance, the harvest pile basin, and the canals from filling with sediment is one of the great difficult problems of beaver life. To guard against the rapid encroachments of the deposits of sediment, one group of beaver, apparently with forethought, built a dam that formed a pond from the waters of a small spring, which carried but little or no sediment. I have noticed a number of instances in which a pond was made on a small streamlet with greater labor than it would have required to form a pond in a nearby brook. As there were a number of other conditions favorable to the brook situation of the house, the only conclusion I could reach was that these selections for colony sites were made with the intention of avoiding the ever-encroaching sediment, for in some beaver ponds this sediment is deposited annually to the depth of several inches. Ice is one of the troubles of beaver existence. It is of the utmost importance to the beaver that he should have his house so situated that the ice of winter does not close the entrance to it, and also that the deep water in which his pile of green provisions is deposited does not freeze solid, and thus exclude him from the food supply. The ice fills the pond from the top, and compels him to be constantly vigilant to save himself from its encroachments. Many a beaver home has been built alongside a spring, around which the beaver dredged a deep hole, and in this deposited the winter food supply. The constant flow of the spring water prevented thick ice from forming, both around the food pile and between it and the house entrance. Large numbers of beavers do not possess a house. Beaver who live without a dam or pond commonly do not build a house, but are content with a burrow or a number of burrows in the banks of the waters which they inhabit. In the severe struggle to live, there is a tendency on the part of the beaver to avoid the building of dams and houses, as these reveal their presence and put the aggressive trapper on their trail. Many colonies have both houses and burrows. Apparently the houses were used in the winter-time, the burrows in summer. One beaver burrow, which I examined, was about 1 foot above the level of the pond and 12 feet distant from it. The entrance tunnels were 16 feet in length and began a trifle more than 3 feet underwater near the edge of the pond. This burrow measured 5.5 feet long, about half as wide and 17 inches high. It was immediately beneath the outspreading roots of an Engelmann spruce. The majority of beaver burrows are about 2/3 the size of this one. One November, I examined more than a score of beaver colonies. There was no snow, but recent cold had covered the pond with ice and solidified the miry surroundings. Over the frozen surface, I moved easily about and made many measurements. One of these colonies was a fairly typical one. The colony was on a swift-running stream that came down from the snowy heights 3 miles distant. The top of Long's Peak and Mount Meeker looked down upon the scene. The altitude of this colony was about 9,000 feet. The ponds were in part surrounded by a semi-boggy willow flats, with here and there a high point or a stretch of bank that was covered with aspens. The tops of a few huge boulders thrust up through the water. All around stood guard a tall, dark forest of lodgepole pines. These swept up the mountainside, where they were displaced by a growth of Engelmann spruce which reached up to timberline on the heights above. This colony had a number of ponds, with a few short canals extending outward from them. A conical house of mud and slender poles stood in the larger pond. Above this pond there were 6 pondlets, the uppermost of which was formed across the brook by a semicircular dam. Over the outward ends of this dam the water flowed and was caught in other ponds. These in turn overflowed, the water traversing 2 other ponds, one below the other, just above the main one. Below the large pond there were 3 smaller ones in close succession. The dam of each pond backed the water against the dam above it. The dam of the main pond was 230 feet long. Each end bent upward at a sharp angle and extended a number of yards upstream. This dam measured 5 feet at its highest point, but along the greater portion was only a trifle more than 3 feet high. The central part was overgrown with sedge and willows and appeared old, but the extreme ends appeared new and probably had been in part constructed within a few weeks. The whole dam was formed of earth and slender poles. The pond formed by it was 180 feet wide and had an average length up and down stream of 110 feet. The average depth was only 2 feet. Near the center of this large pond stood the house, a trifle nearer to the dam than to the upper edge of the pond. I measured it on the water, or rather the ice level. It took 26 feet of rope to go around it. The top of the house rose exactly 5 feet above the ice. The house was built of a mixture of sods and willow sticks. the ends of the sticks here and there thrust out through the 3 or 4-inch covering of mud which the house had recently received. Wondering how much of the house was in the water below the level of the ice, I thought to measure the depth by thrusting a pole through the ice to the bottom. Holding it in an upright position, I raised it and brought it down with all my might. The pole went through the ice, and so did I. The water was 3 feet deep. This depth covered only a small area around the house and was maintained by frequent digging. The house is often plastered with this dredged material. Altogether, then, the house from its lowest foundation on the bottom of the pond to the conical top was 8 feet high. The foundation of this house was made of turf, masses of grass roots, and a small percentage of mud thickly reinforced with numerous willow sticks. The floor was mostly sticks. As the entrance tunnels were filled with water to a point about 3 inches below the floor level, and as these were the only entrances or openings into the house, friend or foe could enter only by coming up through one or the other of these water-filled tunnels from the bottom of the pond. The single circular dome-like room of this house was 4.5 feet in diameter and about 2 feet in height. Its ceiling was roughly formed by a confused interlacing of sticks which stood at an angle. The spaces between were filled with root-matted mud. The walls were a trifle more than 2 feet thick, except around the conical top. Here was a small space, mostly of interlacing sticks, the thickness of which was but 1 foot. As very little mud had been used in this part, there were thus left a few tiny air holes. As I approached, there could be seen arising from these holes the steamy and scented breath of the beaver inhabitants within. The single circular dome-like room of this house was 4.5 feet in diameter and about 2 feet in height. Its ceiling was roughly formed by a confused interlacing of sticks which stood at an angle. The spaces between were filled with root-matted mud. The walls were a trifle more than 2 feet thick, except around the conical top. Here was a small space, mostly of interlacing sticks, the thickness of which was but 1 foot. As very little mud had been used in this part, there were thus left a few tiny air holes. As I approached, there could be seen arising from these holes the steamy and scented breath of the beaver inhabitants within. Since the ventilation of beaver houses is exceedingly poor, and as this animal probably does not suffer from tuberculosis, it is possible that ventilation is assisted and some of the impure air absorbed by the water, which rises almost to the floor in the largest entrance holes. The early trappers from time to time noted extended general movements or emigrations among beaver, which embraced an enormous area. They, as with human emigrants, probably were seeking a safer, better home. Some of these movements were upstream, others down, commonly away from civilization, but occasionally toward it. For this, the Missouri River was the great highway. Limited emigrations of this kind still occasionally occur. The annual migration is a different affair. This has been noted for some 150 years or more, and probably has gone on for centuries. This peculiar migration might be called a migratory outing. In it, all members of the colony appear to have taken part, leaving home in June, scattering as the season advanced. Rambles were made up and down stream, other beaver settlements visited, brief stays made at lakes, adventures had up shallow brooks, and daring journeys made on portages. The country was explored. The dangers and restrictions imposed during the last 25 years appear in some localities to have checked this movement, and in others to have stopped it completely. But in most colonies it still goes on, though probably not usually enjoyed by mothers and children except to a limited extent. By the 1st of September all have returned to the home, or joined another colony, or assembled at the place where a new colony is to be founded. This annual vacation probably sustained the health of the colonists. They got away from the parasites and the bad air of their houses. The outing was taken for the sheer joy of it. Incidentally, it brought Beaver into new territory and acquainted them with desirable colony sites and a route thereto, useful information in case the colonists were compelled suddenly to abandon the old home. It is natural for the beaver to be silent. In silence he becomes intimate with the elements, and while listening hears and understands all moods and movements that concern him. He is a master in translating sound. It wakens or warns, threatens or gladdens, and woos him back to slumberland. On the wild frontier in his fortress island home in safety he sits and sleeps in darkness. He cannot see the outside, but the ever-changing conditions of the surrounding outer world are revealed to him by continuous and varying sounds that penetrate the thick, windowless walls of his house. He hears the cries of the coyote and the cougar, the call of moose, the wild and fleeting laugh of the kingfisher, the elemental melody of the ouzel, and many an echo faintly from afar. He hears the soft vibrations from the muffled feet of enemies, and above his head the raking threat of claws upon the top of his house. Endlessly the water slides and gently pours over the dam, and softly ebbs upon the pond's primal shores. The earthquake thunder warns of storm, the floods roar, then through day and night the cleared and calm stream goes by. The wind booms among the baffling pines, and the broken and leafless tree falls with a crash. There is silence. Along the stream's open way through the woods, numberless breezes whisper and pause by the primitive house in the water.